All right, folks. Good evening, everybody. Steve with Real Progressives. Tonight we have our regularly scheduled Saturday night with Joe Firestone, Fireside Chats with Jay Fire. But one of the things I want to talk to you guys about real quickly before we dive into the meat of the subject. Joe and I were talking before the show, and welcome, Joe. We were talking about. It's great to have you on here, and I hope folks understand, long term, how long people have been fighting in general to get MMT on the map, to try to get people to understand what we'll call macroeconomic reality, and people have been largely in academia pushing this. There are obviously a lot of us folks that are self-taught that have been tutored by the forces of good, such as yourself, Joe, and others. But quite frankly, macroeconomic reality, you're trying to sell truth. It's not even a theory. You're trying to sell, hey guys, there's a lot of myths floating around out there, and it's really killing our movement. And so we're here as activists saying, we love you, academia, but we've got to blaze a trail. And that's what we're doing. So, Joe, what has your experience been trying to play Mr. Rogers, trying to be the good guy, Mr. Congeniality, trying to present a subject that people really are struggling with?
Well, I have to admit that I don't try to be as much of a good guy as some people in the MMT movement try to be. I've always been, I'd say, a little sardonic and forceful side in the way that I criticize people who say they are on the left and who really are on the left, but who adhere to the of the Peterson network in some way. And I've been working at this since 2010, and soon after I started, I encountered Peterson, and his influence, and I also saw the influence that he had in the DC community with people, with really the most left of progressives within the Senate and the House. And so I began to critique some of the economists who ran with the people in Washington, even people like Dean Baker, for example, from time to time, who I think is generally a wonderful economist and very much on our side in terms of the politics of it. Of course, also, I would save a lot of serious and rude critiques for Krugman, for Grayson, and for Kucinich, and for Sanders at the beginning also, because Sanders, of course, never gave up the rhetoric of reducing deficits and the importance of, fiscal responsibility until I think Stephanie Kelton arrived on the scene in 2015 when he gradually backed off. He's still using variants of we need taxes to spend, and that's why we got to get those rich folks and their tax money. And I would very seriously criticize that at various times from 2010 to 2015. And then basically when Stephanie got appointed, as his economic advisor, then I began to lay off Bernie because I figured she was the inside person and have to give her a chance to take care of it. And at least she got him off speaking aggressively about how we had to show fiscal responsibility and be very careful with, the size of the deficits that we ran, and then gradually morph into somebody who didn't talk much about the deficits at all, unless he was forced to, by the Clinton critiques. And then, of course, he would always go and show that the taxes he planned to implement were going to cover his deficit spending. So he hadn't really withdrawn from the position, but by then it seemed to be a question of whether he would make a decision in the campaign to try to educate and also win, or to say, I won't take the education on, I have to do what I have to do to try to win. Now, I still think that judgment was a mistake, but I'm not walking in his shoes, and I don't have his experience in the political fray, and I still have no doubts about his good intentions and where he stands. So for that reason, I backed off criticism of Sanders for the duration of the campaign. But I still remain very critical, okay, of many other progressives.
Let me ask you a question on that. Dennis Kucinich, Sherrod Brown. These are two guys that were seen as the standard bearers of the left, and both of them supported a balanced budget amendment. Both of them they were both economic illiterates. I mean, that is a shame.
Yeah, Paul Bluestone also. Paul Bluestone, before he died.
You mean Wellstone? Wellstone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Wellstone.
That's
a really, really wonderful guy.
Yes.
Okay.
Econ-illiterati, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say that. In other words, when it came to poverty programs in states and how to squeeze the money out for state spending and stuff like that, he was always on the right side. He wanted to squeeze it out, and he wanted to allocate it in the right way. And he still represented that point of view when he got Congress. But when he got into the Congress, he didn't learn anything new about how federal money is handled and how it can be allocated, and whether there was a great deal of increased policy space as a result of the operations that the federal government goes through with respect to money. He never showed any interest in that. It was always, well, tax and spend and tax and spend and tax and spend. Okay. And so many, many wonderful people were in this corner for a very long time. Paul Simon, for example, who was a very good guy, was in this corner as well. And the liberals during the 1980s and 1990s, in the post-Keynesian period, who grasped on to the Peterson type of framework and were faithful to it all the way up to the present.
That's crazy. All right, so Joe, let's talk real quick about the subject at hand. We had talked offline about the very, very important subject of inflation. And, inflation seems to be the thing that people that are, they're really not terribly sharp when it comes to economics. They have some old school teaching, maybe got a sniff of some blog somewhere or watched the late night show with Ron Paul. I don't know. Whatever it is, they were doing something that had nothing to do with reality. And they dove headfirst into something that they didn't know. It's like a briar patch, and they came out with a bunch of sticky wickets all over them. They didn't really know what the hell was going on. Tell me a little bit about inflation. Talk to us about inflation so we can put this baby to bed.
Okay. Well, I'll start with just simply the observation that as we've gone through many broadcasts here, not just in my broadcast, okay, but in Ellis's broadcast and in many other broadcasts also, there have been people who post questions dealing with whether printing money is inflationary. Why do they think it's inflationary? Because printing or otherwise creating money without issuing interest-bearing debt instruments to accompany the creation of money increases the money supply. And they learned somewhere along the line that increases in the money supply are directly related to increases in prices. So they reason printing money is inflationary just because of the operations of supply and demand. If more money is available to people, the more they're going to bring the demand into spending, and they'll need more products to fulfill a demand. And when too much money is chasing too few products, you're going to have inflation. And they learned that somewhere along the line. Where did they learn it? Well, first of all, this is a rudimentary form of the well-known quantity theory of money, which I'll discuss in detail, just a little bit later. But for now, the important point is that they learned about the quantity theory of money without perhaps learning the equations or without perhaps learning a formal economic presentation of it, in many cases when they went to high school. I know when I went to high school, we had some history courses that covered the First World War and the aftermath of the First World War. And it covered the Weimar period from 1919 through about 1923, okay, and later, but especially in the 4 years after the First World War, you had a situation where Weimar was increasingly printing money, increasingly printing the Reichsmark. And at first you had a relatively small degree of inflation, and then it accelerated, and then it accelerated, then it accelerated, then it became a hyperinflation. And what a hyperinflation was like was illustrated by the historians by pointing to cartoons where people were wheeling huge quantities of paper money to the bakery using a wheelbarrow in order to pay for a loaf of bread so they could get bread every day. And then there were stories about how people would get up in the morning and look at the price of things and then go to the store after lunch and find that the price had gone up by a considerable amount, by a drastic amount, okay, by lunchtime. And that there were these periodic, very, very high increases in prices, which were caused by a cycle of the government printing the Reichsmarks, distributing the Reichsmarks to people in various ways, okay, and in order to stay even with the increases in pricing of foreign exchange, which the government needed to get in order to pay Germany's war debts. They needed hard currency, foreign currency, in some cases, actual gold. And they had to pay for that with their Reichsmarks. And as they printed more and more Reichsmarks, the international markets changed the exchange rate and made it less and less favorable to the Reichsmark. So they had to print more and more and more and more. And that was the process through which Weimar Germany got into the currency hyperinflation. So, having learned that, okay, in high school, having seen the cartoons Having heard the stories of what a bad experience this was for people, I know at the time it had an impression on me. And the impression it had was that I believed that it was very important to keep inflation under control. Now, for Germans who actually had that historical experience, they are today inflation nuts. They will do anything to keep inflation down. They're convinced it's the worst evil, of all. And that accounts, I think, for a lot of their attitudes with respect to creating money to help the Greeks or creating money to help some of the poorer countries in Europe. At bottom is their fear of inflation occurring again, of the kind that they experienced during the Weimar Republic, and the stories they heard when they were children about the bad times Germany had had, including the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic. Okay. So it's early educational experiences and historical beliefs which are stereotypical, which people learn at an early age in school, that become a part of the culture. And the simple idea that printing money is inflationary becomes a part of all the Western cultures. I think this meme is present in all of the major Western nations and a lot of the non-Western nations too. Okay, and it's based on historical experience, but only loosely based on historical experience. It's not based on a close analysis of the historical situations where the hyperinflations have actually occurred. Okay. So, having said that, printing money need not be inflationary. It's not a major cause of hyperinflation, and it isn't really more inflationary than creating money using the alternative methods which a fiat currency sovereign will use. And I'll discuss this as we go forward. And then finally, I'll get to the quantity theory of money and try to show why the quantity theory of money is false. Okay. So let's start by talking about the methods used to add reserves to the Treasury spending account, often known as the Treasury General Account, which I will refer to as the TGA. Okay, first we have to recognize a basic. When Treasury, which is the government spending arm, as well as its taxing arm, when the Treasury Department spends money, it's got to have reserves in its accounts to spend. Shorthand, we'll say it has to have reserves in the TGA. Now, Treasury, however, does not have the authority by itself to mark up the TGA. So, new reserves added to the TGA are really the sphere of the Federal Reserve. And so it's the Fed that marks up the Treasury accounts. But the Fed is not authorized to do that by law until Congress mandates spending. Now, we know how Congress mandates spending. It appropriates the money through legislation. So congressional appropriations are at the bottom of the Fed having the authority to mark up the Treasury accounts. One condition.
On command from Congress, though, right? Congress doesn't operate.
Congress.
That's right. So make sure everybody hears that loud and clear. Spending
Now,
is
Congress
done.
to authorize it in some way. Now, there is a condition under which the Fed can fill the Treasury account without Congress explicitly authorizing it in an individual case, because Congress has already authorized this particular method of filling the Treasury accounts, and I'll get to that method, okay, in a moment, by passing legislation which gives authority to the executive to allow the Fed to fill up the Treasury account when Treasury sends it a particular kind of message. And in a few minutes, I'll get into what that particular kind of message is. Okay, and here my account will be somewhat controversial. Okay, but let's get into the three categories of methods that are needed to authorize the Fed to add credits to mark up the Treasury accounts. First, when taxes are paid to the Treasury Department and they appear, once they're paid to the Treasury Department, then the Fed must credit equivalent amounts to Treasury accounts. And it credits the Treasury tax and loan accounts with an amount which is equivalent to the taxes that have been paid. Now, it's important to note that it doesn't use the tax money, okay, in any particular way. In other words, when the tax money goes to the Treasury, that in effect is no longer in the private sector, it's destroyed. And the Fed, though, having the record of the destruction, then is authorized to mark up the Treasury account. Now, when Treasury securities or other federal property is sold to anyone else, the Fed then must credit the equivalent amounts to Treasury accounts. Okay, and again, it might it may credit some of this to the Treasury tax and loan accounts. Okay, and it might be crediting some other accounts when the Treasury sells property other than Treasury securities. Okay, but these markups are markups done on Treasury accounts. And Treasury has the authority to sweep all of those accounts and to bring the credits there into the Treasury spending account when it has a mandate to spend from Congress. Okay? So that's the second condition under which the Fed is authorized to mark up the Fed accounts. Now, I'm sorry, the Treasury accounts. So here's the third condition. When coins are minted by the Treasury Department and are presented for deposit within Treasury accounts, then the Fed must credit the Treasury accounts for the face value of the coin. Now, which particular account does it credit? Since the coins are produced by the mint, when the mint ships the coins to the Federal Reserve Bank for deposit, then the Federal Reserve Bank must credit the Treasury account, specifically the Public Enterprise Fund, it's called, and that's an account of the mint, with the face value of the coin. Now, there are some costs to this process because the material that goes into the coins costs something, and there's a cost to shipping it up to the New York Fed, and there might be a cost, okay, for armored cars to transport the coins to the New York Fed, and there are labor costs involved, obviously. So those are monies which the Fed has to lay out. And what ends up in the public enterprise fund account is the face value of the coin, but that is not what we call the profits from the coin or the coin seigniorage. The coin seigniorage is the face value of the coin minus the costs of producing the coin and getting it into the public enterprise fund account. Now, there's a way in which this process, the coin seigniorage process, works differently from the other processes that we discussed, the other two processes. Okay, in the other two processes, there are amounts which are created, which are roughly in the range of the federal spending that has been mandated by the Congress. Okay, but in the case of coin seigniorage, there need not be a close relationship. It's possible to produce platinum coins with face values in the many trillions of dollars and deposit that up at the Fed, filling the public purse or the Treasury General account with far more money than Congress has mandated spending. Now, if that money were to sit in the Treasury General account, which it does not actually today, it could not be spent by the executive. The executive would have to limit its spending to the appropriations that Congress has made. In other words, to the mandated spending which the executive branch has. So theoretically, anyway, you could get a huge amount of money in the public purse going way beyond what Congress has appropriated. Okay, but again, it could not be legally spent. All right. So now let's go further. These operations of getting the Treasury accounts credited are just that. They don't actually fund the spending.
Hey, Joe, real quickly, you got some people out there scratching their heads, looking at each other saying, oh my God, I am so lost.
Okay, let's get some questions and see if I can answer some questions about where they're lost.
Okay, so folks, for those of you who are looking around, I see, wait, what? I just want to make sure that people that have questions, just go ahead and ask them real quick. I'll put it up on the board, and we will go ahead and answer some questions real quick about what has gone on so far. Ginger Bowman, I see you out there. I think I'm going to have to read about the basics to be able to. What does markup mean? Coins and credit.
Okay, but Okay, let me explain what a markup means. Okay. When somebody gets the Social Security payment and it is deposited in their private account, then the value in your account, the value of the money in your account, okay, the amount of US dollars in your account, okay, are marked up. If the Social Security payment, let's say, was $1,200, the amount in your checking account would be marked up by $1,200. Okay, so that's what markup means. It just means adding dollar credits to your checking account.
So here we go. We got, are the coins the ones for sale as commemoratives, or are they for us like a dime?
Okay, the answer is some of the coins that are minted, okay, are for general circulation. There are other coins which are issued for commemorative purposes, but the law that authorized the platinum coin did not restrict the issue of such coins, but to commemorative purposes. It was very clear about that, and it allowed the minting of platinum coins in whatever denomination the Secretary of the Treasury cared to specify. It left it up to the Secretary of the Treasury, in other words, to determine the amount of the coin that would be created. It set no limits or constraints on this.
Here's a real good question that I get from a lot of different people. I know the answer, but I think it's worth discussing this, so that the average person gets it. The amount of coinage and the amount of paper dollars is completely infinitesimal next to the amount of digital dollars in circulation. I mean, but Joe, can you explain that to him a little bit? He's saying, does the Federal Reserve banks have the actual money, he's calling actual money in coinage and bills, to cover the numbers at each person's bank account?
The answer is no. Okay, I think current estimates are something like that 97% of the dollar credits out there sitting in banks are not covered by bills or by coins. They were electronically created, and the Fed was delegated the Congress's power to create money, which has been interpreted over the years by the courts to include coining money, creating paper money, and also creating reserves in banks, which are dollar credits in banks. So the Federal Reserve has the money creating power.
Okay, let's see. Did that answer your questions? Let's see what else we got out here. Here we go. This is the final one. Ted, this is your final question, brother. And then we're going to move on. So he's like, why is our Congress stuck on a balanced budget if we can print? Well, he's using the word print, but I would say money creation, create deposits. Why is it that they are trying to trick us into believing we need a balanced budget?
Okay, well, Congress is not a single person, and not having studied the Congress in the way one would have to study the Congress to make out what the collective understanding is, what you have to do is to point to the idea that there are different reasons why people in Congress don't want to use this power. But one of the reasons is not even a question of them wanting to use it or not wanting to use it. They do not believe it exists. That their understanding of money comes from courses in economics which are pretty well teaching doctrines of economics that were accepted in gold standard days, but that are not consistent with the fiat money operations that we have now. And there's a large number of people in Congress, I'm sure, who have this kind of understanding, okay, of money. That basically federal money is somewhere, somehow, in some way backed by gold or other commodities. And so their understanding is that the federal government cannot simply print money or create money because that's going to cause inflation. So in other words, much of Congress are victims of the quantity theory of money that we were talking about before and that we will talk about again. They are victims. Now, there are some people who are very well informed when it comes to our monetary operations. They have gotten informed by people at the Federal Reserve. They have gotten informed by people at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. They have gotten informed by certain economists. They've gotten informed by our own Warren Mosler. Okay, and so they know there are people out there whose understanding of money is that there are no limits in the amount of money the federal government can create, that it's not limited to taxes and to borrowing, but that the issue is really inflation. Now, when Congress people believe this, they may also believe that they don't want to discuss the issue of inflation versus the desirability of having full employment. Because back in the 1950s and 1960s, when those issues came into conflict, the people supporting full employment were generally the victors. And the people who were overly concerned about inflation in the Congress were beaten in election after election. And so they were very happy when the Peterson Doctrine gradually took over Washington, and they were very happy with the inflation, in some ways they were happy with it, that occurred in the 1970s, because they viewed that as delivering an object lesson to the public as to what could happen when the government was deficit spending too much. Now, of course, Jimmy Carter did not deficit spend too much. He had very small deficits. He was very fiscally responsible, even though he never succeeded in his ultimate goal of actually balancing the budget. But they ignored that and insisted the cause of the inflation was too much government spending. Well, we know today, and a lot of us knew back in the 1980s, that it wasn't that at all, that it wasn't what we now call demand pull inflation caused by deficit spending, but that it was cost push inflation caused by the oil suppliers and the central place that their products had in the American economy, such that when they decided to raise the price of oil considerably, those price rises percolated through the economy of the United States and artificially drove up the prices in many areas that were indirectly related to oil. So the inflationary period under Carter was not caused by deficit spending. It was caused by the oil inflation, which was further fed by Paul Volcker's continuous raising of interest rates to try to kill the economy and to get rid of inflation in that way until he raised those rates up to something like 21%, if I recall correctly. And then that finally cooled off the economy, which had been overheated by the oil price rises and the frantic attempts of people to force increases in their salaries and wages to try to keep up with the rising prices. So people did not understand that. You know, the large number of people didn't understand that, perhaps until very recently. So the people who were afraid of inflation then got a leg up, and particularly the Peterson ideology got to be very popular in Washington, got to be popular among Republicans as well as Democrats. Not so surprising for the Republicans, but it got popular under Democrats too because of the influence of Peterson and Alice Rivlin, who was a close associate, of Peterson, and who had been the first director of the Congressional Budget Office, and who was a fiscal hawk, but a good Democrat, and liked by all Democrats. Kidding and nice, little lady, and very personable. Okay. So Democrats liked her, and she made sense to them, and Peterson did too, and a whole bunch of economists did too, as neoliberal economics emerged increasingly from the shadows. And then this created a Congress where people couldn't even talk about sizable deficits to try to compensate for downturns. Couldn't even talk about it. It was a subject which would be panned by most of the conventional wisdom in Washington and by the media too. The Washington Post had gone over to fiscal responsibility sometime in the late 70s, early 70s. And the New York Times soon after went over to the fiscal responsibility shtick. And in fact, the press as a whole did. And there were no voices for spending large sums of money to fuel the economy if deficit spending was involved. So then the whole conflict came down to, well, how much can we level in taxes to pay for the good programs? It all came down to that, and accounts for the defeat of the progressives over the last 30 to 40 years.
Joe, let me jump in for a second.
Okay, so I hope I answered that question. I think what I did is I went much further.
You did. Can we just hit this question so we don't, because you never refuse to address anything. So I find it extremely disrespectful and quite abominable that he would say, why do you refuse? But he says, why do you have refused to address the guns and butter driven inflation of LBJ in the late 60s? They did not start in the 70s. The oil price war was started by LBJ. I have no idea why he would think you were refusing to address that or anything else. But since it's raised in such a manner, let's go ahead and just hit it out of the park. I find that very offensive.
Okay, well, I don't mean to be offensive in this respect, but I would say a couple of things about that. First, during the 1960s and during the time of LBJ, the United States was not a fiat currency sovereign. In international trade, it was still on the gold standard. It was Nixon who took us off the gold standard. So we were not a monetary sovereign then because we constrained ourselves.
So this is a gold standard issue here, right, Joe? You're kind of frozen. I hope we get you back. I hope the question didn't lock us out. Oh, no. All right. Well, I'm going to give it a second to see if Joe's connection comes back. I'm hoping that it does. Oh, well. All right. We're going to have to figure out the technical problems here with Joe's connection. We're going to come back, bring it back to myself. So while I'm waiting to see if we get Joe back, bottom line is let's just say it like this. There's nobody here not addressing something. There's nobody here refusing to address something. You've got a PhD doctor that absolutely understands this inside and out, is trying to teach people something. He's not trying to jump from here to there and there to here to appease your pet question, although he did try to answer everyone's question. Now, if you want to come here and learn and be a part of it, that's fine. But stepping up and saying, why do you refuse to answer this? You know what? Any good graces we may have had when you talk like that, done. Done. You get it? Done. Done like done. Joe Firestone has been devoting himself to trying to teach people from Jump Street. He's a man, as a doctor, he's not gaining a cent from trying to do this. He's literally out here fighting for you and I. And somebody comes in and says he refuses. Why do you refuse? Screw you. You hear me? All good graces 8-track. So with that, I'm going to end this thread because it doesn't look like Joe is going to be able to come back. But I just want to make sure everyone understands, you know what? Man comes out here, tries to teach people, tries to take time from his life, from his family. No gain here but to teach. And people say, why do you refuse? Screw you. Anyway, with that, I hope you guys have a great night. We'll talk to you tomorrow.